Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I'm going to do some fan service and hop back into the world of Baldur's Gate and Dungeons and Dragons. And what better way to do that than to dive into the lore of the namesake of Baldur's Gate himself, Balduran. This is a great one, in my opinion, because not only do we get some great 5e lore, but we also get a ton of new information from Baldur's Gate 3. And with that being said, there are plenty of spoilers for this episode if you haven't finished Baldur's Gate 3. We're going to be talking about some revelations from Act 3 towards the end of the game, so this is a very spoiler-heavy episode if you haven't finished the game. So just a fair warning that this is going to be a very spoiler-heavy episode. So please go finish the game, then come back to this episode, and we're all good. And very quickly, before we get started, I just want to ask that you rate this podcast 5 stars wherever you're listening to it, or like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. The only way that I know that you're properly enjoying the content that I make is if you let me know. So please rate the show, leave a comment, or send an email to lordtodeath@gmail.com to suggest an episode, or just say hi. I also think it's worth noting that this is officially our 40th episode of the show, and that's not including the break weeks or the intro or any of that. So 40 proper lore episodes, which I think is bonkers, quite frankly. So thank you to everyone who does listen, and thank you to everyone who keeps recommending me content, because as much as I do this show for myself, I really do it because people seem to want it. Thank you for 40 episodes, and maybe we'll get to another 40. We'll see. So with that out of the way, let's get on with the episode. Baldur's Gate was not always the massive walled city that we all know and love today. It was once just a small harbor settlement called Grey Harbour, settled in the continent of Faerun just along the eastern Sword Coast, which was mostly known as a hideout for pirates, scavengers, and other shady folks. Grey Harbour was a secluded haven where people could stash their looted treasures and sell them off for coin. And it was this Grey Harbour that was home to Balduran the Brave, who was a young human male that yearned for adventure. Being a harbor town, there was likely little else to do but sail, fish, and trade. Balduran, known as Baldur to his friends, was the first to sail across the Trackless Sea to the east of the Sword Coast beyond Evermeet, the home of the elves. It's said that Balduran sailed out in a simple search for resources that could be logged and brought back to his home of Grey Harbour so that they could build up and he could give something back to his home. Whether he did so knowingly or not, he ended up sailing far east and discovered an entirely new continent, which was known as Ankarome. And he was the first native from Faerun to set foot on those lands. But that doesn't mean it was uninhabited. There was a native population there. He was just the first one from Faerun to step foot on it. He was gone for years before returning to his home, but when he came back, he was no longer just an unremarkable man from Grey Harbour. Balduran came back from Ankarome with untold riches. The contents of his pillage are unknown, but they are known to have been fairly vast. Balduran came back with tales of strange lands across the seas and the loot that was just laying there for him. But he did not come back just to brag about his wealth to those in Grey Harbour, but instead invested it in his town. After all, he just set out for some logging supplies or other things to build up Grey Harbour with, so when he came back with far more than he bargained for, why not put it back into the place where he lived? Balduran became a philanthropist, giving to those in need amongst his friends and family, or giving it to the farmers to put up walls around them to protect them from orc barbarians who would raid their fields. This massive wall that he invested in would end up being more important and defining in the town's history than Balduran likely knew. And in honor of the one who made it possible, one of the gates of this massive wall was named after him. This is pretty far in the future, and it would be past his time, but this gate would be known as Baldur's Gate. It started off with just the one gate being named after him, and then the entire city eventually just became known as Baldur's Gate because of the significance of this gate. And it said that if not for Balduran, Grey Harbour would have been nothing, an insignificant blip in the dozens of settlements along the Sword Coast. But because of the investments made by Balduran, the town was able to become more than just the harbor for criminals that it was known for, and it was able to become the bustling metropolis that we know it as today. Because of the wall that was built around the town, farmers were able to start taxing carts coming up from the docks into the protection of the city, generating extra revenue with which they were able to continuously expand the city. And as the city expanded around it, Grey Harbour remained a core part of the settlement, which would be later referred to as Old Town. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, so let's get back to Balduran. Somewhere along the line, whether it was before or after his voyage to Ankarome, I'm not really sure, but I would hazard to say that it was before, and Ansur was probably with him when he sailed to Ankarome. Baldur met Ansur, who would become his best friend and potentially more than that. Ansur, however, was a bronze dragon. His true form was that of a bronze dragon, but like most metallic dragons, he spent most of his time in a humanoid form, which closely resembled that of a bronze dragonborn. I would personally love to know how they met, whether it was in Ansur's dragon or humanoid form. I wonder if Ansur in his humanoid form was a regular around Grey Harbour, or if maybe Balduran met him as a dragon in his adventures. Either way, I think that there's a lot of story there. There's a lot of lore that I think could be explored, and I think it would be pretty neat. But unfortunately, we don't know, and will likely never know, the details of their first meeting. But what we do know is that they were very, very dear to each other, adventuring together and being faithful to one another almost to a fault. It's very much implied that they were more than friends and potentially even lovers. And it's honestly much more than implied in a letter titled Dear Ansur, where Balduran writes, "You are the greatest thing that ever happened to me, Ansur. Be free, Ansur. Fly, and know that even when I'm not beside you, I will always have been your Balduran." As well as a conversation in-game where they simply refer to themselves as more than friends. You can read this in many different ways, like a deeply affectionate, platonic relationship more akin to brotherhood as to lovers. But I'm definitely in the latter camp. I feel like through understanding their interactions together, as we'll kind of get into, it reads as a tragic love story. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself once again, and I just cannot reiterate how much these two cared for each other because it's very important to the rest of the episode. And whether or not you see them as friends or lovers doesn't really matter in the end, it's all just opinion. But regardless, the two would spend plenty of time traveling together, whether it was far north to the Great Ice Sea in search of the Great Spire built by the Gondor gnomes, or trekking across the Kalim Desert. The two were never far apart. But at some point in the mid-11th century DR, Balduran would embark on one final adventure. And this time, he would go without Ansur. Most had no idea where he went. Some theorized that Ankarome stole his heart, and that he had sailed back east to find a home there, and that he had died of old age. Others say that maybe his ship was taken by raiders and his body was lost to the sea. And while the latter is potentially more correct than the former, neither of those were necessarily the case. And maybe these theories were correct, but to know that, we're going to have to jump forward about 300 years. In the year 1364 DR, one of the dukes of Baldur's Gate, Grand Duke Eltan, set out to find the final resting place of Balduran. And I know we're talking about Balduran, but we've barely talked about his life at all, and now we're already talking about his death. Just hold on, it'll kind of make sense. We'll get back there. And why did they decide to try to do this after all this time? Probably the same reason why some jackasses tried to find the wreckage of the Titanic. Curiosity and clout. Is that too soon? Either way. They decided the best way to follow in his footsteps was to sail to Ankarome, where they thought he might have ended up at. On the coast, they found a ruined fort with plenty of rusted and broken weapons and armor, along with a ship's logbook. They presumed that this was where Balduran and his crew had ended up, and while they were searching the wreckage, they were assaulted by a group of local elves, and made the assumption that this might have been the same fighting force, or potentially the descendants of that fighting force, that Balduran encountered, and the search party was forced to retreat lest they share Balduran's fate. However, it seemed like this was misguided, and there was no actual reason to believe that this was the wreckage of that of Balduran's crew, and furthermore, no reason to assume that this is necessarily where he had died. A few years later, in 1368 DR, the shipwreck of the Wandering Eye, Balduran's vessel, was said to have been found along with a logbook, which had entries from Balduran himself. Though much of it was damaged, there was one lone survivor named Dreadil, who was able to parse through the information and shed some light on what had happened. It turns out that on their way past Evermeet, the vessel was boarded by some elves whom Balduran personally took some issue with, finding them to be suspicious, and he found a way to get them off his vessel as soon as possible. Then, when they reached Ankarome again, they were met with some of the native population who took issue with Balduran for some issues that he may have caused during his first visit. What this was about, I'm not really sure, but it doesn't seem like there's any more information about his first visit to Ankarome, unfortunately. However, Balduran was permitted to pass through the lands because of the strength of the crew that he brought with him. They managed to amass another trove of treasure, which they loaded up onto their ship and headed eastbound and down back to Baldur's Gate, when they were attacked and Balduran lost half of his crew. Needing to replace the number that was lost in his crew, he conscripted some of the locals to his crew and they began sailing. Among those locals who he had conscripted, he found a shaman who, again, he took issue with and had him thrown overboard. Bad move, Balduran. Bad move. Because the rest of the trip was plagued with bad weather and beetles infesting the food supplies, which led to an all-time low in crew morale. They were able to find an island on their way back and forcibly set anchor and hopefully replenish some of their supplies when things took an even sharper turn for the worse. Members of his crew started showing signs of sickness, which apparently turned out to be lycanthropy. And if you know anything about lycanthropy, you know that it is not exactly a good time. The members of Balduran's crew who weren't yet infected were soon killed by those who had transformed, and the Wandering Eye was damaged to the point where it wasn't even seaworthy. Dreadil was able to fend off the lycanthropes and became marooned on the island until he was rescued by some passing-by adventurers, along with the other members that survived with the crew. Amongst the wreckage, they were able to salvage some of Balduran's personal effects, which ended up in a museum in Baldur's Gate. And it's not said what happened to Balduran specifically, but we can assume that he was among the living who was saved by the adventurers because his story seems to continue, and he managed to make it back to Baldur's Gate, or at least very close to it. Balduran heard of some fabled treasures that lay beneath Moonrise Towers in the Western Heartlands, a location that most people listening to this episode will be more than familiar with. It said that Balduran's ship was capsized and he was taken captive while looking for this treasure trove. Being so close to the Underdark, there was always the threat of running into Drow, Dragar, or worse, Illithids. And I'm going under the assumption that everyone listening to this episode knows about Illithids, or Mind Flayers, as they are more commonly known as. If you didn't catch it, I do have an episode about Mind Flayers, so go ahead and listen to that one if you haven't already. There's a lot of really good information in that episode that will help you to understand why they are the threat they are, and it'll help you understand the following a bit better as well. I'm going to reference that episode quite a few times in the next little bit, so if you haven't listened to the episode on Mind Flayers, go back and do so, whether it's before or after this episode, doesn't really matter. And the reason why I'm putting so much emphasis on the Illithids is that, unfortunately for Balduran, he accidentally ran headfirst into an Illithid colony and was captured, infected with an Illithid tadpole, and underwent ceremorphosis, turning him into an Illithid enslaved by the colony's Elderbrain. There's not much worse of a fate than being taken and turned into an Illithid. In the episode I just mentioned, I go through the entire process of ceremorphosis, but I think it's worth reiterating that one who undergoes this process ceases to be themselves. The tadpole consumes its host's brain and uses it as sustenance to grow and take over the body as they become an Illithid. Because there's no brain left, the host is no longer who or what they once were. They are now entirely an Illithid whose entire purpose is to serve the Elderbrain, which exerts a field of control over every Illithid within a certain radius, and this was the fate of Balduran. Or so it seems, anyways. Balduran remained an Illithid and served the Elderbrain in the Underdark colony for around 10 years. I see some sources stating that it was around 14 years, but from what I remember from in-game, it was closer to 10 years. And this was according to a record of interrogation by Enver Gortash. And for all that time, his friend Ansur was probably looking for him. as Balduran didn't allow Ansur to come with him on his last voyage, which lasted who knows how long, probably years, and Ansur became concerned about the fact that his little sweetling had not returned for several years, and so he had set out to find him. I wish that there was an account of this anywhere other than just a vague mention, because I think it makes for a great story, or it would make for a great story, rather. But somehow Ansur managed to rescue Balduran, or at least what remained of him. And yes, that does mean that he went down into the Illithid colony and managed to save the Illithid that was once Balduran. And I have a problem with this. A big problem that will come up time and time again, and something I brought up in my episode about mind flayers, and I'll be damned if I don't repeat it again. Balduran should not have been Balduran anymore. He was an Illithid. There are many different kinds of Illithids, sure, but the average Illithid, as Balduran would have come to be, looks exactly the same as the other dozens of Illithids in their colony. As this is a product of seramorphosis and part of the Illithid grand design, that they are the perfect beings who basically all mirror one another. Furthermore, like I mentioned before, through the process of seramorphosis, one ceases to be themselves as they are transformed, because the Illithid tadpole literally consumes their brain matter in order to kickstart the transformation process. This is known and is documented through every source material that there is on Illithids up to this point, until this game, except for one other. And that source is about a bedtime story where there was an Illithid who maintained the memories of who they were before seramorphosis, and managed to stay conscious as themselves and overthrow an Illithid colony. This being was known as the Adversary, but there's nothing more to suggest that this was anything more than a myth, and even if there were anything to suggest that this actually happened, it only ever happened once, and as far as I'm concerned, it was a myth created by Illithids to further introduce mistrust amongst themselves, and to make them aware of bad eggs who might not be fully under the Elder Brain's control so they can weed them out, because that did happen on occasion. There were renegade Illithids amongst Illithid colonies who weren't entirely under the control, but they were still Illithids. They were not who they were before they became an Illithid. The only documented cases of an Illithid retaining anything from their former life was in subconscious tics like humming a familiar tune, or tapping their feet, or writing a certain way, or something that was so ingrained in the host's muscle memory that it just kind of happened when they were drifting into a daydream. But again, it was a subconscious movement, not a memory or a part of themselves actually coming through. And you might be thinking, Brett, that's a pretty cynical take, and you might have contradicted yourself by bringing up the myth and unconscious tics, and I disagree. There's so much lore out there that states that an Illithid and the host cannot exist at the same time, and I think all of that source material trumps any myth or coincidence. You could, however, come to the view that the Adversary was real, and that Balduran ended up having the exact same thing happen to him, where he was himself in an Illithid's body. That's pretty convenient for the rest of the story, and it's pretty convenient for someone who basically built up Baldur's Gate to retain their memories and still live underneath Baldur's Gate, basically. And I just think it's too much of a coincidence to subscribe to that train of thought, but you could take it that way, and I'm not saying that you're wrong if you do take it that way, that Balduran was the same as the Adversary, or maybe the Adversary was Balduran. Because as we know, Illithids exist kind of across all of time, so maybe Balduran was the Adversary, and that myth made it back in time, and was told throughout time to warn people that this was going to happen. But again, I don't really subscribe to that theory. I think that this is more or less impossible, but I do have my own theories. I'll save that for later. Furthermore, onto my last furthermore, it had been a decade since Balduran disappeared, or I guess just over. And I don't doubt that Ansur would have been able to trace Balduran's footsteps to Moonrise Towers. Ansur was an adventurer, after all, and I think that part of the story is entirely likely. I also believe that a bronze dragon would have been able to go into an Illithid colony and come out on the other side. That seems perfectly likely. What I don't think is likely is that Ansur managed to find one Illithid amongst the entire colony, identify him as Balduran, and rescue him. I just don't think that could be possible, and yet, here we are. Allegedly, Ansur was able to rescue Balduran from the Illithid colony and take him outside of the Elder Brain's influence, where somehow Balduran was still Balduran through seramorphosis. I'm going to come back to this towards the end of the episode because I think I have a little bit of a crackpot theory, but I think it's the only thing that actually makes any amount of sense that isn't just saying that Balduran was the adversary. But for now, let's just continue with the story of Balduran. Even though Balduran was taken outside of the Elder Brain's influence, he was still very much an Illithid, although he allegedly had the full memories of his previous life as Balduran, with one fairly large exception. He could no longer feel emotion. That meant that he no longer felt any affection towards Ansur, as reflected in Dear Ansur, where he writes, "I may no longer feel my feelings, but I know yours, and yours are agony." This agony that he describes is the agony that Ansur's lover might as well be gone if he could no longer feel any affection towards him. This agony caused Ansur to search far and wide for an answer to bring Balduran back in his entirety. Balduran didn't wish to be an Illithid either, but he understood that no amount of medicine or medical professionals could bring him back. He pleaded to Ansur that he should stop trying to find a cure and accept the situation for what it was. Balduran was now an Illithid, full stop, and eventually, Balduran embraced his new form. He came to understand that the psionic powers that he was granted were a boon, not a curse, a natural part of his evolution into something greater. Of course, this evolution came with the fact that he had to feed on brains to sustain himself, but he decided to prowl the streets looking for criminals to feed on, attempting to make his home of Baldur's Gate a better place in his own little way. But Ansur could not abide by this. We learn that Ansur would not cease trying to find a way to revert him back to his human form as the Balduran that he once knew and loved, even when asked repeatedly to stop once Balduran had accepted his new form. And so, Ansur decided that the only cure that he had not tried yet was breaking his mortal coil, and attempted to murder Balduran in his sleep as an act of mercy. Balduran awoke before this act could be done and stood his ground against Ansur, who would not back down from this course of action. Wielding his Giant Slayer greatsword, which conveniently worked against dragons, I'm not sure if that counted when Ansur was in his human form or not, Balduran struck Ansur down in an act of self-preservation. Ansur's remains were taken far below Worm's Rock Isle, which we can assume was named after the fact that Ansur's remains were laying there, and this was in Baldur's Gate and left in what would be called the Dragon's Sanctum. This spot would be the place of legends and generally thought of as a myth since it was hidden away, and I didn't find anything to support this exactly, but it seems that Balduran had this place built specifically for Ansur. There are statues of Balduran throughout the area, leading those who would enter through a series of tests to determine whether or not they were worthy of entering the sanctum. While it may have seemed like a myth that there was the corpse of a dragon underneath Worm's Rock, there were a few who truly believed it to be the case and not a myth, like older Ravengard, Will Ravengard's father, who, during the crisis that happened during the events of Baldur's Gate 3, believed that the only way to take down the Absolute was to awaken the dragon and have him fight alongside them. But anyways, after all of this kerfuffle, having killed his closest ally, Balduran decided that this was still his city, and he would use his new form to rule from the shadows since no one would accept an Illithid openly ruling them. He forged a close relationship with Duke Stelmane, who was on the Council of Four at the time. This council was a group of 4 wealthy individuals who were chosen to rule Baldur's Gate in a plutocracy, which basically just means the wealthy rule. Balduran would help Duke Stelmane and meet with her on matters that concerned the city, governing forces behind the Knights of the Shield, who were the largest mercantile operation in Baldur's Gate, and eventually became known as the Emperor. And I'm guessing that he never indulged Duke Stelmane that he was once Balduran, and that created the necessity for a pseudonym to refer to him by. And yes, this is the same Emperor that we meet in Baldur's Gate 3, and he tells us all of this in-game in bits and pieces, revealing only what is necessary at that point to gain our trust. And I think that it should be plainly obvious, but I think it's worth noting that everything the Emperor has told us should be taken with a grain of salt. Whether he was actually Balduran or not, the one thing that Illithids all have in common is that they lie incessantly to save their own skin and to further their own plans. If we assume that he was indeed Balduran, then we have to assume that the story about how Ansur tried to kill him in his sleep might have been exaggerated, if it was even true to begin with. I would sooner believe that since Ansur was assumedly the only one who knew of the Emperor's identity as Balduran, the Emperor killed Ansur in cold blood so that there was no one else that could tie him back to his original identity, and he could start new as the Emperor. He probably would have wanted to preserve the image of Balduran and have people believe that he was lost to sea or living out a lavish retirement in Ankarome, and not turned into something that they could only fear. That's my opinion, though, and I think that I have every right to be skeptical about everything that the Emperor says. Skepticism aside, the Emperor was doing his best to take control over the city that was once his home. He started to overreach with the Duke Stelmane, and their relationship deteriorated over time. It's unclear exactly what facilitated this change, but it was probably something along the lines of the Emperor taking too much too quickly. Perhaps he was pushing his own agenda to the point where it was obvious to Duke Stelmane that he was using her as a pawn in his own twisted game. Perhaps she tried to speak out against him and get him off of her back, and the Emperor threatened her life. I wouldn't put it past him. And I just want to say that it's hard to say how long the Emperor had been trying to rule from the shadows, but we can do some quick maths. One source says that Balduran sailed to Ankarome in the mid-thousands DR, and we know that he spent 10 years in the Illithid colony, and we can gather that he spent a few years in Baldur's Gate itself while it was being built up through his philanthropic efforts. So we can safely say that Balduran was back in Baldur's Gate as an Illithid somewhere between 1080 and 1100 DR. But then there's the other source that says that he left on his final journey in the mid-1100s DR, but that doesn't really make sense if he was born in the mid-thousands DR, as he was only human. His lifespan was not that long. So I'm going to go with him being an Illithid somewhere between 1080 and 1100 DR. The events of Baldur's Gate 3 take place in 1492 DR, so we have a period of about 400 years where the Emperor is potentially attempting to run Baldur's Gate from the shadows. But we know that Duke Stelmane died to the members of the Cult of Baal after suffering a stroke which left her as a shell of her former self in 1491 DR. So that relationship definitely didn't come up until later, and this was likely the peak of the Emperor's influence over Baldur's Gate. So before he even knew Duke Stelmane and was maybe officially known as the Emperor, he had been doing this for 300 some odd years. I just think it's interesting to put all of this into perspective because it makes the story of Balduran and the Emperor so much more interesting, knowing that he was in the city when it was just Grey Harbour, and he was there through the forming of the metropolis that is Baldur's Gate and was able to directly see the fruits of his efforts being put into place to build it up. And Illithid or not, having the memories of Balduran, seeing his city being built up, that makes sense why it was so important to him. Over time, people began to know of the Emperor, but only in name and not identity. They had no idea what he was, only that they were seemingly the one who was making the city run. However, one day someone would learn of his true identity and bring it all to ruin. That person was Enver Gortash, the chosen of Baal and the leader of the Absolute. Gortash, who we should all be familiar with at this point, found out the true identity of the Emperor, or at least he found out that he was an Illithid who was attempting to run Baldur's Gate. Who knows if he knew that he was potentially once Balduran, and Enver Gortash had him abducted. The Emperor would be sent back to the Illithid colony and back to the Elder Brain, where he would once again be subjected to its will, but not entirely. He clung to his moniker, the Emperor, as it brought him some sense of comfort, even in his full Illithid form under the Elder Brain. This Elder Brain was the same one that he was held captive to when he was abducted several hundred years ago, when he was initially turned, but it was a new beast at this point. The Elder Brain was under the influence of the Dead Three, who used the Netherese Crown of Karsus to have it do their bidding for the cult of the Absolute. The crown was stolen by Enver Gortash and the Baal spawn known as the Dark Urge, who took it from the vault of the Archdevil Mephistopheles and used it to enslave the brain. The entire point of this was to be able to implant Illithid tadpoles into people's heads and not have them undergo seramorphosis immediately. The tadpole would lay dormant until the Elder Brain gave the command turning all of the affected into Illithids immediately, essentially giving the Dead Three an immediate overwhelming army at the snap of a finger to take over Baldur's Gate in the blink of an eye. And that brings us to the events of Baldur's Gate 3, or just before it in the same year of 1492 DR. The Illithid that was once known as the Emperor was sent out on a mission to retrieve the Astral Prism, which was a Githyanki device that had two different purposes. The first was to act as a navigational device, which led to a pocket dimension where the descendant of Gith, Orpheus, was being held. The second purpose was directly related to the first fact, because Orpheus was basically attached to this artifact, which meant that it projected a field which disrupted the effects of Illithid psionics since Orpheus inherited that gift from his mother. That might sound a lot if you haven't listened to the episode on the Githyanki and the Githzerai, so I do have an episode all about that where I explain this more in detail. Another plug, I know. And since this artifact had the ability to disrupt the influence of the Elder Brain and other Illithids, including the tadpoles that lay dormant in people's heads, it was a very clear threat to the Dead Three, Gortash, and the Absolute in general. You might think it's a mighty fine coincidence that the Emperor just happened to be among the search parties, but it wasn't a thing of chance in the slightest. The Elder Brain, while enslaved, had its own notions of overthrowing the Dead Three and their chosen, so that it could have its own free will back. The brain must have known of the Emperor's past and his strength, and specifically chose them to do their bidding, unbeknownst to the Emperor. Still, a good coincidence that the Emperor was back under the control of the Elder Brain, and that he was able to be chosen for this mission, but it was all part of the plan. Aboard a nautiloid with an inquisition of other mind flayers, the Emperor was among the first of several parties to locate the Astral Prism. Upon making contact with it, his free will was given back to him as the artifact began to nullify the effects of the Elder Brain. He was able to escape into the prism, where he was able to find a void of solace in the Astral Prism along with Orpheus, who was also imprisoned there. Having taken the artifact from the Githyanki, the nautiloid was soon overtaken by Githyanki dragon riders, which is where we start the game. The player character, along with the Githyanki warrior Lae'zel and the Shar-worshipping Shadowheart, crash land onto the beach with the artifact and thus begin their journey, unaware of the influence that the Emperor had in their survival, as from the prism he was able to still use his psionic powers and stop them from dying upon impact with the ground. And so the Emperor helps the party in their journey and leads them to get rid of the chosen of the Dead Three. At first he attempted to mask his true form by coming to them in visions as their dream guardian, disguised in a form that was more suitable to their tastes, something more humanoid. Eventually the gig was up, and his form as an Illithid was revealed, and he pleads to the player character that this ruse was a necessity, since they wouldn't have trusted him in his Illithid form initially, which is likely true. He continues to spin tales throughout the story, telling lies and twisting the truth where it needs to be in order to get the player character on their side. And unfortunately, this is where things get a bit tricky, because the game is very open-ended and driven by decisions that the player character makes, leading to it being a vastly different experience for everyone who plays it. I've gone over everything that is concrete, however, and the only thing that's really left to the wind is the ending of the game and how that potentially affects the Emperor's fate. But I don't really feel like I need to go over those, because as far as I know, there's no canon ending, and I want to make sure that this episode is as close to canon as we get. So, what of Balduran's legacy? Well, aside from having the city be his namesake, there are also plenty of statues of Balduran around the city, including a massive statue in the river Kionthar that looks over Grey Harbour, which is fitting since that was his original home. There was also a citywide celebration known as Returning Day, which marked Balduran's return to Grey Harbour from Ankarome. Aside from that, the population that resided in Baldur's Gate were referred to as Baldurians, sort of named after him, and in the city there was a mausoleum in the High Hall which stood as the resting place for Baldurian dukes, and also contained relics from Balduran's past, such as his cloak, his spyglass, and a longsword in a cracked leather sheath, which were all found from the wreckage of the Wandering Eye. And, I mean, how can you ask for a better legacy than having a city erected in your name? I think that the effects of his importance are quite evident just in that fact. And you probably thought I was done, but I have One last thing to add, and that's the ranting and rambling that I promised before about a theory that I have on the Emperor regarding how he managed to keep his memories. I started writing a joke about getting your tinfoil hat ready about some crackpot theory, but I genuinely think that this is the best answer, and so I can't even make that joke without undermining my own theory. So this whole thought process comes from the idea that the Emperor kept his memories as Balduran through seramorphosis. I've explained how this isn't generally accepted as being possible from many sources, pretty much all of the sources. And I go into further detail in my episode about the Mind Flayers as to why I don't think that should be possible, and I stand by my statement, but I come to you now with some updated information and a proper theory as to what I think happened. Balduran definitely went on that excursion to Moonrise Towers, and I'm certain that he got captured by the Illithid colony. The story goes that he was captured, taken in, and underwent seramorphosis to become an Illithid, and he managed to retain his memories from his previous life as Balduran. But knowing that the tadpole consumes the host's brain matter in order to turn its body into that of an Illithid, I don't think it's possible that he retained more than the occasional subconscious tick from his previous life. As I've mentioned, can happen with some Illithids. And I'm here to say that I don't think that Balduran got implanted with a tadpole. I do not think that he underwent seramorphosis, and I do not think that he got turned into a Mind Flayer. I think that he and his party were instead just killed, and their brains were devoured by the colony instead. From page 221 of the 5e Monster Manual, we get the following. An Illithid experiences euphoria as it devours the brain of a humanoid, along with its memories, personality, and innermost fears. And I believe that our answer lies in that passage, and the statement is enough to back up my point. A Mind Flayer not only gains nourishment from devouring a brain, but it also gains a part of that person as well, including parts or all of their memories and personality. I think that an Illithid simply devoured Balduran's brain and gained his memories and basically impersonated him through the rest of their life. 10 years later, when Ansur came into the colony, whether he was looking for Balduran or it was just by happenstance on a scouting mission, this Illithid who had Balduran's memories would have recognized Ansur immediately and saw it as a way out. They would have had to roll a nat 20 on their performance check, but maybe they reached out telepathically to Ansur and begged him to get him out of there. And so Ansur did what he thought was right for the person he thought he knew. But why would an Illithid have any reason to impersonate a random person who they consumed? Well, a Mind Flayer's goal is to enact the grand design, which is to say take over the multiverse. Balduran was a historically significant person who lived above them in Baldur's Gate. This would mean that being able to impersonate this person would inevitably lead to being able to take a position of power on the surface, which is evident by the Emperor's actions leading up to the game, which goes directly in line with something that an Illithid would desire. Any Illithid could have this notion to use Balduran's memories as a means to gain power, but if that's not compelling enough, then it's also entirely possible that the Emperor might have been an Ulitharid, a noble amongst Illithids who was seen as nobility, and were not so easily controlled by the Elder Brain, and often went on to found their own colonies and become Elder Brains themselves. And Ulithard would see this as an opportunity to gain power for themselves and directly contest the Elder Brain. But I'm not sure that this was the case, as an Ulitharid was innately stronger than even the strongest amongst Illithids, but they were also very recognizable just by their physical appearance, being larger and having distinctly longer tentacles than the others. And we see the Emperor in-game compared to other Illithids that we see are pretty similar. There aren't any major physical differences other than the robes that he wears, but his tentacles are basically the same length as anyone else. So that being said, it would make sense if the Emperor was an Ulitharid, since the Elder Brain later chooses them out of the colony to lead an expedition, and they would choose someone who they knew was stronger than the rest. But I choose to just believe that they were a regular Illithid who consumed the brain of Balduran and used his memories to gain power within Baldur's Gate. This theory makes sense to me, and it fits nicely within the established lore instead of intruding upon it and making its own rules. Not to say that Larian wasn't given the leeway to do so, and I'm sure that they came upon the myth of the adversary and thought that that was something that they could use, But I think that changing the decades of lore on mind flayers to say that it's possible to retain your memories through seramorphosis is a bit insane. And since it's more or less left up to interpretation, since there isn't much detail given about Balduran's disappearance, I, again, think that this is the most lore-friendly way to approach it. And I think it gives an extra dimension of malice to the Illithids using someone else's memories to influence the ones they love and gaining power through it. It really feels like an Illithid thing to do. And that wraps up this episode on Balduran and the Emperor, and brings me to the question that never gets any answers. What do you think? Do you think that my theory about Balduran being consumed by an Illithid rather than being transformed has any merit? Or do you think that he was able to just retain his memories through seramorphosis? You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so if you head over there and hit subscribe, I would really appreciate that. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me, or at lordtodeath@gmail.com. If you're using the Spotify app, there's a comment section attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics, and if you're on YouTube, leave a comment. I would love to hear from you. And remember, history tells us that you can do great things by sailing west to a new continent and terrorizing the local people into giving you riches beyond measure, which you can bring back home so you can build a big-ass wall and turn into an alien. That doesn't mean you should steal from the local populations and use it for your own gain, but I guess if your life as a fishmonger gets boring, then it's always technically an option. And I'll lure you to death in the next episode. See ya.